Hello, I'm Mark Fletcher. I'm a PhD student at the Australian National University studying the public understanding of law. And this here is another of me playing with video formats for very brief explainers. Today, a debate that rages across media, both social and in the press. Has Scott Morrison shirked his responsibilities as Prime Minister with regard to quarantine? And have the premiers had to fill a federal void? More formally, under Australia's federal system, what responsibilities belong to the Commonwealth and what belong to the states in our response to COVID? Let's start with the public intuition. There are a lot of people who think that the premiers of the states are like the number twos in the hierarchy of Australian government, that they somehow report to the Prime Minister. The way that we talk about coordinated national responses imply that the Prime Minister has this overarching chairperson role, breaking deadlocks and making the final call on contentious things. And the media has a role in this. We have way more in the way of national news, especially in the online environment, and there's simply less relevance of any one premier to the average Australian. If you can find a Victorian who can successfully tell you who the Prime Minister is, which is not universal, you'd find a subset again who would be unable to name the Premier of Western Australia or of Tasmania. It's simply not useful information, and so the role of the Premiers is reduced. And I don't think there is any problem at all in thinking that the Prime Minister of Australia should be the ultimate head of Australian government generally. It's not a stupid intuition. There is a feeling that there should be a final boss who's in charge of the whole lot. If the Victorian government is screwing up, there is a feeling that you should be able to write to the Prime Minister and say, hey, we need you to step in and fix this. And this follows the public model of what happened recently with the Victorian branch of the Labor Party. When there were revelations about corrupt behaviour and branch stacking, the federal branch of the Labor Party took over. And that seems to make sense to a lot of people. But also, federalism has been surprisingly fluid in Australia since 1901. Federalism looked very different in its first decade than it did in the previous decade, even if you don't take into account the impact of referenda. The Constitution provides a structure for people of the day largely to work out how they want the system to work for themselves. And this is good. Just because a bunch of long-dead guys who were not even slightly representative of modern Australia said that the system should be structured this way, they should not get the final say. It's your country, it's your government, your constitution. You should get what you want. Within reason, most of the time. So federalism was extremely popular way back in ye olde times, because there was this ongoing question about why very large political units struggled to function. In the age before fast cars, jet planes and instant messaging, you could only go as fast as a horse, and therefore a person on one side of the country struggled to access political institutions on the other side of the country. It led to this view that smaller nations were more democratic and more representative. Local problems could be solved by local people together who had to look each other in the eye while arguing their point. But bigger nations are more powerful. Superpowers are always big. You get economies of scale, standing armies that don't look terribly embarrassing, and they're hard to invade. So you get this problem. You want your nation to be big and powerful, but you want a tiny local government to run it. So federalism was extremely popular in the 1700s and 1800s because you can limit the power of the biggest political unit. If any one group wants to bring about a prosperous new world and impose its vision of utopia on the rest of us, it needs to control lots of political units instead of just the one. The biggest political unit in this style only gets enough power to do the bare minimum of what it needs to do, and the smaller groups are able to resolve local problems locally. Federalism is not about promoting good government, but instead about reducing the consequences of bad government. Federalism in Australia occurred after the United States and Canada federated, and so the Australian drafters of the Constitution could adopt and adapt the bits of each system that they liked to innovate their own model. Australian federalism has a lot of policy overlap between the states and the Commonwealth. Not only did the states hand over only as much power as it thought the Commonwealth needed, in nearly all cases they also retained the ability to use those powers. Despite this retention of powers, the High Court's interpretation of the Constitution have effectively expanded the scope of the Commonwealth's powers. Think about environmental protection, the Racial Discrimination Act, or regulation of the internet. These are areas where the Commonwealth has been able to push the powers it was given to breaking point, and the High Court went along with it. There is another dimension. The economic structure of Australia resulted in what people call the fiscal imbalance. The Commonwealth has a lot of power outside its legislative abilities because it holds the purse strings. Alfred Deakin once said that although the Constitution is fondly supposed to have protected states' rights, it left them legally free but financially bound to the chariot wheels of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth has a lot of leverage, and it is big news when a state or territory refuse to take a bucket of cash for a policy outcome that the Commonwealth wants. For example, when the ACT rejected money to pay for the chaplains program after the High Court said that it was beyond the legislative competence of the Commonwealth. Despite the murkiness of this description, the basic intuition about Australian federalism remains true. States give powers to the Commonwealth. Prior to Federation, they had practically unlimited powers. Through the Constitution, the states gave powers to the Commonwealth, nearly always retaining the ability to concurrently use powers that were given to the Commonwealth. And then, following Federation, they have also voluntarily handed additional powers over to the Commonwealth without needing a referendum. For me, the big one here is legislative competence for national security law, but it also includes family law and, somewhat confusingly, a beefier corporations power following a High Court decision in 1990 that the Commonwealth's corporation power was less beefy than everybody thought. But it's fundamental to get this intuition right. The Commonwealth only has powers that states have expressly or impliedly conceded. And this means that there are three types of powers in Australia's federal system. If it's not mentioned in the Constitution, either directly or impliedly, it's a residual power, and that means the power sits with the states. If it's directly or impliedly mentioned in the Constitution that the Commonwealth can exercise the power, then it's a concurrent power exercisable by both the Commonwealth and the states, unless the Constitution expressly states that the states can no longer exercise the power, in which case it's an exclusive power of the Commonwealth. There are very few exclusive powers, the major ones being that the states are not permitted to create their own currency or establish their own defence force. In practice, there's another way that areas of law effectively become exclusive, and that's through paramountcy, where there's a conflict between Commonwealth and state law, but don't worry about this because it's not actually relevant here. So what powers are mentioned? Your usual stop for this question is Section 51 of the Constitution, which begins, "The Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws for peace, order, and good government of the Commonwealth with respect to..." and then has a list. Notice that it says shall have the power and not must make laws. There is nothing to stop the Commonwealth from sitting on its hands with regards to these issues. More precisely, because we're remembering that most powers mentioned in the Constitution are concurrent, there is nothing saying that the Commonwealth is responsible for the matters listed in Section 51. So, for example, Placidum II gives the Commonwealth powers regarding taxation. But states have always had and always will levy their own taxes, especially on property and payroll. Section 51(9) is the quarantine power. At the time of Federation, it was about ships bringing people and cargo and the ability of the Commonwealth to prevent those ships from, quote, having intercourse with the coast. Of course, it was envisaged that science and technology would change quarantine somewhat, so the power is in its broadest sense. What is interesting is that the US Constitution does not have an express power of the federal government for quarantine. And it seems that at the time of Australia's federation, the Americans had established a workaround for this, so our drafters made it simple and easy by including the power. Quick and Garron, which is a commentary on the Constitution. One of the authors was central to the drafting of the Constitution, the other was an active member of the convention debates, notes a weird Canadian case about puzzles of quarantine power that I won't get into. Suffice to say that the quarantine power is quite broad. It's certainly broad enough to cover both the quarantining of people as well as its main focus, the quarantining of goods. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that states cannot exercise quarantine powers, and so it's concurrent. But there's another thing about Section 51, and that's what's not listed. Things you might expect to be there, such as education, the arts, industrial relations, or health. And it's this last one that's important for this discussion. The states have the clear legislative competence, not the Commonwealth. Consider the regulation of health practitioners in Australia, for example. Given that it's a national scheme, you might think that Commonwealth legislation was involved. Instead, it's a complex nexus of state legislation. Each jurisdiction passes the same national law in order to create health practitioner regulation across Australia. So now we see how quarantine powers work in the context of the current crisis. The Biosecurity Act of 2015 is Commonwealth legislation based on the Commonwealth's quarantine power. But to be comprehensive and effective, Section 564 of the Act allows for funding agreements with the states to appoint Human Biosecurity Officers. This allows an integration of the quarantine power, which the Commonwealth possesses, with the most obvious necessary health powers, which the Commonwealth lacks. There's no shifting or shirking here. If the Commonwealth did want to legislate a comprehensive response to COVID-19, it would be open to a fairly obvious constitutional challenge, and then you're rolling the dice on the court agreeing that the Commonwealth has sufficient power. States obviously have the powers needed, and that's why this framework is in place. One final point. The federal balance has shifted under the last few coalition governments in perhaps a surprising way. In 2009, Tony Abbott published his political views in a book called Battle Lines. The book argued, amongst other things, that we should have a referendum to make it easier for the Commonwealth to take powers without the consent of the states. 5 years later, his views had radically changed, championing a white paper to discuss rebalancing responsibilities across Australia's federal structure. Importantly, he wasn't Prime Minister in 2009, but he was in 2014. With the Commonwealth taking the view that the state should have greater responsibilities, there is an increased need to ensure that there is coordination of those powers. This drives the shift that we saw from the Council of Australian Governments, which was largely just a platform for premiers to get national media attention for spitting out some wild hot takes about how much they hate the Commonwealth, to the National Cabinet, which is supposed to be a private deliberation body for obtaining joint positions from members. But it's not necessarily the case that the legal facts should prevail here. As I said at the start, if there's widespread public sentiment that the Prime Minister should be front and centre of our response to the pandemic, it's not a silly intuition. But there's a difference between must and should. The Prime Minister has not shirked quarantine obligations. He has literally followed the model that Australian federalism has developed, and premiers have simply done the job that they're clearly empowered to do. And if that's the case, then it says something interesting about the broader public's view about federalism. The Australian people really do expect the buck to stop somewhere, and that seems to be with the Prime Minister. But if that's the case, then the Commonwealth needs more powers and responsibilities at the expense of the states. And that's it for this one. This was narrowly on the quarantine power, so perhaps a better target would have been emergency powers. Generally, does the Commonwealth have powers to handle existential threats to the nation? The answer to that question is, yeah, maybe, but you need to roll the dice on a good court outcome. The major case there involves the late Brian Pape, who was a legal academic at the University of New England, and his High Court challenge to Rudd's stimulus package during the global financial crisis. All lots of fun, and I get to use way more Alfred Deakin quotes. This video responds a little bit more directly on the media criticism of the Prime Minister, so maybe more relevant. I don't know. Let me know your views over on Twitter @LegalReckoning. Bye-bye.